Charles Whitmore had visited his daughter's grave alone for 3 years, carrying white lilies in unbearable guilt. But this morning, someone was already there. A black janitor in worn coveralls, kneeling at Lily's headstone, crying while holding a baby who reached toward the carved name. Charles demanded to know why this stranger dared intrude on his private mourning. The man looked up and mentioned a childhood scar no one outside the family knew about, then said something that made Charles's blood run cold. Lily didn't die the way he thought, and this baby shouldn't exist. What Charles didn't know was that his trusted advisor had orchestrated everything, and the truth buried 3 years ago was about to explode in ways that would destroy an empire, but save what truly mattered. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. Charles Whitmore stood at the iron gates of Riverside Memorial Cemetery, gripping a bouquet of white lilies so tightly the stems bent beneath his fingers. The early morning fog clung to the manicured grounds like a veil, softening the harsh edges of marble headstones that stretched across rolling hills. He came here every year on this date, always at dawn, always alone, always carrying the same flowers his daughter had loved since childhood. 3 years had passed since Lily died, yet the weight of that loss pressed against his chest with the same suffocating force as the day he received the call. Charles Whitmore, a man whose name commanded boardrooms and whose wealth could reshape markets, was powerless against the simple, crushing reality that his only child was gone. The security guard at the gate nodded respectfully and opened the entrance without a word. Everyone here knew Mr. Whitmore and his ritual of grief. The path to Lily's grave wound through the oldest section of the cemetery, past ornate monuments erected by families who believed granite and bronze could somehow preserve memory. Charles walked slowly, his expensive leather shoes crunching against the gravel pathway. Birds were beginning their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance, a groundskeeper's equipment hummed softly. The world continued its indifferent rotation while he carried flowers to a daughter who would never see them. He reached the gentle slope where Lily's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, exactly as he had requested. She used to love sitting under trees, finding peace in the way sunlight filtered through leaves. Charles had paid for this specific plot, this particular tree, believing somehow it would bring her comfort even in death. The thought seemed foolish now, but grief made people cling to anything that felt like connection. Charles stopped abruptly, still 50 feet from the grave. Someone was already there. His eyes narrowed, confusion giving way to a sharp spike of anger. In 3 years of these private pilgrimages, he had never encountered another soul in this corner of the cemetery. The caretaker had assured him this section received few visitors. That was part of why he chose it. Lily's resting place was supposed to be a sanctuary from the world that had taken her too soon. The figure kneeling at the grave was a man, his back turned to Charles. He wore dark blue work coveralls, the kind janitors and maintenance workers used. Even from this distance, Charles could see the man's shoulders shaking. He was crying, openly weeping at Lily's grave. Charles felt his jaw tighten. This was private ground, sacred ground. Whatever this stranger's purpose, he had no right to intrude on this moment. The protective fury that had been dormant for years suddenly flared to life. First, the world took his daughter. Now, it sent trespassers to disturb even this small ritual of remembrance. He approached quickly, his footsteps deliberate and loud against the grass. "Excuse me," Charles said, his voice cold and commanding. "This is private property. You need to leave." The man's head lifted slightly, but he didn't turn around immediately. He seemed to be collecting himself, wiping at his face with one hand. In his other arm, Charles now noticed, the man held something wrapped in a worn blue blanket. A baby. The man was holding an infant. "I said you need to leave," Charles repeated, stepping closer. "Now." The man finally stood, turning slowly to face him. He was black, perhaps in his late 30s, with kind eyes reddened from crying. His face carried the exhausted dignity of someone who worked long hours for little recognition. He held the baby protectively against his chest, and despite Charles's harsh tone, his expression showed no anger, only deep, profound sadness. "I'm sorry," the man said quietly. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I just needed to come here today." "What?" Charles demanded. "Why are you at my daughter's grave? Who are you?" The man looked down at the baby in his arms, then back at the gravestone bearing Lily's name and dates. "My name is Daniel," he said. "Daniel Freeman. And your daughter was the kindest person I ever knew." Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. You didn't know my daughter." "I did," Daniel said simply. "She changed my life." "That's impossible." Lily's friends, her colleagues, everyone who knew her attended the funeral. "I would have known if—" Charles stopped himself, realizing how hollow that sounded. The truth was, he hadn't known much about Lily's life in those final years. She had grown distant, refusing to discuss her work at the company or her personal relationships. Their conversations had become brief and strained, filled with the weight of unspoken disappointments. The baby began to squirm in Daniel's arms, making soft cooing sounds. Then something happened that made Charles's breath catch in his throat. The infant reached out one tiny hand toward the gravestone, fingers stretching as if trying to touch the carved letters of Lily's name. The gesture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that it seemed impossible for a child so young. "How old is that baby?" Charles heard himself ask. 7 months, Daniel answered, gently adjusting the blanket around the child. 7 months. Charles did the mental calculation automatically. If this child was 7 months old now, that meant conception would have been roughly 16 months ago, a full year before Lily died. The timeline made no sense, yet something about the baby's reaching gesture toward his daughter's name sent ice through his veins. "She used to sit right there," Daniel said, pointing to a spot about 10 feet from the grave, near the base of the oak tree. "When things got overwhelming, when she needed to think, she would come to this cemetery and sit under that tree for hours. She said it helped her feel grounded." Charles stared at him. That detail, that specific piece of information, was something only family knew. Lily had discovered this cemetery during college, long before Charles purchased the plot. She had mentioned it once, years ago, during a rare moment of openness. She called it her thinking place. Charles had never told anyone about it. Not business associates, not even close friends. How could this janitor possibly know? "You're lying," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. Daniel shook his head slowly. "She had a scar on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. She got it when she was 7 years old, climbing a fence at summer camp. She told me she used to be embarrassed by it until her mother said it looked like she was marked by the moon goddess." The world seemed to tilt beneath Charles's feet. That story, that exact story, was something only immediate family knew. Lily's mother had died when Lily was 12, taking with her the gentle mythology she had woven around her daughter's childhood injuries and imperfections. Charles had never repeated those stories publicly. They were too precious, too painful. "How do you know these things?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's hands were shaking now. The baby had settled against his chest, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of his coveralls. "Because Lily told me," he said. "Because we talked. Because she trusted me with parts of herself she couldn't share with anyone else." "That's not possible." "Lily worked at my company. She attended charity events. She lived in a penthouse in the city. She didn't associate with—" Charles stopped himself, hearing the ugly implication in his own words. "With janitors?" Daniel finished quietly. "With working people? You're right about that. Mostly. Lily didn't advertise where she went or who she spent time with. She kept parts of her life very private." Charles felt anger and confusion warring inside him. This man knew too much. The details were too specific, too intimate. But the alternative, that Lily had maintained a secret relationship with someone Charles never knew existed, seemed equally impossible. His daughter's life had been transparent, hadn't it? He would have known if she was involved with someone. He would have seen signs. Except he hadn't been looking. He had been too consumed with quarterly reports and board meetings and the endless machinery of maintaining an empire. How many of Lily's calls had he sent to voicemail? How many dinners had he canceled? The last time she called him, 2 days before she died, he had been in a meeting and hadn't answered. She left no message. He never called back. "She didn't die the way you think she did," Daniel said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. Charles looked up sharply. She died in a car accident. Her vehicle went off the road near the river. The police report was clear. Was it? Daniel asked. Did you see her body afterward? Did you review the actual medical files yourself? Or did someone else handle those details? The question landed like a physical blow. Charles hadn't seen Lily after she died. Victor Hale, his most trusted advisor and the company's chief legal officer, had strongly recommended against it. The accident had been severe, Victor said. The body was badly damaged. It would be better to remember Lily as she had been. Charles, numb with shock and grief, had accepted this guidance without question. He had authorized Victor to handle all the logistics while he collapsed into mourning. Who handled your daughter's funeral arrangements? Daniel pressed gently. Who gave you the death certificate? Who controlled what information you received about how she died? Victor Hale, Charles said automatically. He's been with the company for 15 years. He helped manage everything when I couldn't function. Daniel's expression shifted to something that looked like pity mixed with anger. Victor Hale, he repeated, did anyone ever show you her actual medical files? The complete records from the hospital. Why would I need to see medical files? Charles asked, but even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. The cause of death was clear. Blunt force trauma from the accident. Was it? Daniel asked again. He looked down at the baby in his arms, then back at Charles. Your daughter was 7 months pregnant when she died. Did Victor Hale mention that in any of his reports? The words seemed to come from very far away. Charles heard them, understood the individual meanings, but couldn't assemble them into coherent sense. Pregnant. 7 months pregnant. Lily had been expecting a child. His grandchild, and he had known nothing. That's impossible, Charles said, but his voice sounded hollow, even to himself. Daniel carefully adjusted the blanket, revealing the baby's face more clearly. She had Lily's nose, Lily's exact eyebrow shape. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable once Charles allowed himself to see it. This is Hope, Daniel said softly. Lily named her that because she said even in the darkest times, hope was the only thing worth holding on to. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would protect this child. I would make sure Hope knew her mother loved her more than anything in the world. Charles couldn't breathe. His vision narrowed to the baby's face, to those familiar features that were impossible and yet undeniably real. If this child is Lily's, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady, then where has she been for 3 years? Why am I only finding out now? She hasn't been alive for 3 years, Daniel said. Hope is 7 months old. Lily died during childbirth. Or that's what I was told. But the truth is more complicated than that. You're not making sense, Charles said, though his mind was racing through implications and impossibilities. I know, Daniel said, and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm going to come back here tomorrow morning. Same time. And if you want to know what really happened to your daughter, if you want to understand why this child exists and why powerful people wanted to make sure you never knew about her, then you'll be here too. Daniel turned and began walking away, carrying the baby with careful, practiced movements. Charles stood frozen, watching him disappear into the fog that still clung to the cemetery grounds. The lilies he had brought lay forgotten at his feet. For 3 years, Charles Whitmore had believed his daughter died in a tragic accident. For 3 years, he had carried guilt over unanswered phone calls and missed opportunities. But standing at Lily's grave with a stranger's impossible words echoing in his mind, Charles began to suspect that guilt was the least of what he should have been feeling. Something was very wrong, and tomorrow he would be here to find out what. Charles returned to his penthouse overlooking the city with Daniel's words haunting every step. The building's doorman greeted him as always, and the private elevator rose silently to the top floor where luxury insulated him from the world below. But tonight, the expensive furniture and carefully curated art felt like a mausoleum. He poured himself a scotch he didn't drink and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching traffic lights blink far below. 7 months pregnant. The words replayed endlessly in his mind. If Lily had been that far along when she died, there would have been evidence, medical records, hospital visits, physical signs that couldn't be hidden. Yet Charles had seen Lily just 3 weeks before her death at a company event, and she had seemed perfectly normal. Thin, actually. Tired and withdrawn, but not pregnant. Unless she hadn't wanted him to see. Charles pulled out his phone and opened a photo album he could barely stand to look at. Pictures of Lily at different ages. Lily as a child, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Lily as a teenager, rolling her eyes at some dad joke. Lily as a young woman, beautiful and distant, already building walls Charles didn't know how to breach. The most recent photo was from that company event. She wore a black dress and a forced smile. Her eyes looked empty. He zoomed in on the image, searching for any sign of pregnancy. But the photo revealed nothing. Just a sad daughter and an oblivious father, both playing roles they had perfected over years of growing apart. Sleep didn't come. Charles lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling as dawn crept toward the windows. At 5 in the morning, he gave up and returned to the cemetery. The same security guard opened the gate, surprise flickering across his face at seeing Mr. Whitmore 2 days in a row after years of annual visits. Daniel was already there, sitting cross-legged on the grass near the oak tree. The baby, Hope, lay on a blanket beside him, staring up at the leaves. Daniel looked exhausted, like he had worked all night and come here without sleep. His coveralls bore the logo of a cleaning service. "You came," Daniel said simply. "You knew I would," Charles replied, standing awkwardly near the grave. "You dropped a bomb and walked away. What choice did I have?" "You always have choices," Daniel said quietly. "That's something your daughter taught me. She said people with power convince themselves they're trapped by circumstances, but really they're trapped by not wanting to face uncomfortable truths. Don't lecture me about my own daughter." "I'm not lecturing. I'm repeating what she said." Daniel picked up Hope and held her gently. "Lily talked about you a lot. She loved you deeply, but she also felt like she was drowning under the weight of your expectations." Charles wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. How many times had he pushed Lily toward the company? How many times had he dismissed her concerns about the pharmaceutical division's practices? He had built an empire and assumed his daughter would want to inherit it. He never asked if that was the life she wanted. "Tell me how you knew her," Charles said, lowering himself to sit on the grass. The expensive fabric of his suit absorbed morning dew, but he didn't care. Daniel seemed to measure his words carefully. "I work nights cleaning the hospital wing that's connected to Whitmore Industries' medical research facility. But 5 years ago, I worked maintenance at a free community clinic downtown. That's where I met Lily. Lily never mentioned volunteering anywhere. She didn't want you to know. She used her middle name, Taylor. She didn't want special treatment or recognition. She just wanted to help people." Daniel's voice carried a warmth that spoke of genuine affection. "I was fixing a broken sink in the examination room when she defended me against a donor who treated me like I was invisible. She called him out right there, said human dignity wasn't optional based on job title. The donor left angry, and she laughed about it. Said she'd been wanting to tell off pretentious rich people her whole life. Despite everything, Charles felt a ghost of a smile. That sounded like Lily. Beneath the polished exterior she presented to his world, his daughter had possessed a fierce sense of justice. "We started talking after that," Daniel continued. "Just brief conversations at first. She'd ask about my day. I'd ask about hers. She never talked about being a Whitmore. I didn't know who she was until months later when someone mentioned her full name. By then, we were friends. Just friends," Charles asked, needing to understand. "Always just friends," Daniel confirmed. "I lost my wife to cancer 3 years before I met Lily. I wasn't looking for romance. Lily wasn't either. She said she felt like an exhibit in a museum. Everyone looked at her and saw Charles Whitmore's daughter, not a person. With me, she could just be Lily." Hope made a small sound, and Daniel automatically began rocking her gently. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that it was clear he had been caring for this child since birth. "She would bring coffee, and we'd talk during my breaks," Daniel said. "She told me about feeling trapped, about working for your company and discovering things that troubled her, about pressure to stay quiet and play her role. She felt like she was slowly disappearing into the person everyone expected her to be." Charles felt each word like a knife. He had been so proud, when Lily joined Whitmore Industries' pharmaceutical division. He had seen it as her embracing the family legacy. He never considered that she might have felt obligated rather than inspired. What things troubled her? Charles asked. Daniel hesitated. She was reviewing clinical trial data for a new medication. She found inconsistencies. Test subjects who should have been flagged for adverse reactions but weren't. Results that seemed manipulated to rush FDA approval. When she brought concerns to her supervisor, she was told to focus on her assigned tasks and not ask questions above her level. Who was her supervisor? Victor Hale. The name landed with sickening familiarity. Victor had been Charles's right hand for over a decade. Brilliant, efficient, ruthlessly focused on company success. Charles had trusted him completely, even putting him in charge of the pharmaceutical division's legal compliance. Lily tried to go around him, Daniel continued. She documented everything and planned to bring it directly to you. But before she could, things got complicated. The pregnancy, Charles said. Daniel nodded. She came to the clinic one evening shaking and crying. She'd taken 3 pregnancy tests, all positive. She was terrified, not of being pregnant, but of the timing. She said powerful people in your company were already watching her because of the questions she'd been asking. A pregnancy would make everything worse. Why? A pregnancy has nothing to do with pharmaceutical research. She didn't say exactly, just that they didn't want her to have any reason to leave the company or any leverage that might make her feel protected. She was afraid for the baby, afraid for herself. Charles felt cold despite the rising sun. Who was the father? She never told me, just said it was brief and over. She insisted the father didn't matter. All that mattered was protecting the baby. Daniel looked down at Hope with clear love in his eyes. She made plans to leave the city. She had money saved. She was going to go somewhere remote and have the baby quietly, then decide what to do next. She made me promise that if anything went wrong, I'd help her. What went wrong? Daniel's jaw tightened. The car accident. Except it wasn't an accident. Not the way you think. The police report says she lost control on River Road. It was raining. The road was slick. Lily wasn't in her car that night, Daniel said quietly. She was at the clinic. She'd been having contractions and came to see the nurse she trusted. She was only 7 months along. Too early. The nurse wanted to call an ambulance, but Lily refused. She said the moment she went to a hospital, they would know. They would find her. They who? She said people from your company. She said Victor had made veiled threats, had suggested she take a leave of absence for her health. She interpreted it as pressure to disappear quietly. Charles stood abruptly, pacing near the grave. This couldn't be real. Victor was difficult sometimes, overly protective of the company's interests, but murder? Conspiracy? These were the plots of movies, not reality. The nurse called me in a panic, Daniel said. By the time I got there, Lily was gone. Someone had taken her. The nurse said security people arrived with paperwork saying Lily needed immediate hospitalization. She was too frightened to refuse them. I tried calling Lily's phone. Nothing. The next morning, the news reported she died in a car crash. If she wasn't in the car, whose body was identified? I don't know. I assumed it was her eventually. But the timeline was wrong. The crash supposedly happened at midnight. I saw Lily at the clinic at 11. There's no way she was in both places. Charles pulled out his phone and searched for the police report he'd never actually read in detail. Victor had summarized it for him, and grief-stricken, Charles had accepted the summary as fact. Now he read the full document with fresh eyes. Time of accident, 11:47 p.m. Location, River Road, 2 miles north of the bridge. But if Daniel was telling the truth, Lily had been at a clinic downtown at that exact moment. Where's this clinic? It closed 6 months after Lily died. Building was condemned and sold. But I kept the address. Daniel recited it from memory. Charles calculated the distance mentally. From that downtown location to River Road would take at least 40 minutes even with no traffic. The timing made Daniel's story plausible. Uncomfortably plausible. What happened to the baby? Charles asked. If Lily was taken to a hospital, if she gave birth, where were you? I went to every hospital in the city, Daniel said, his voice breaking. Nobody had records of Lily Whitmore being admitted. I called your office, and they told me Mr. Whitmore wasn't accepting calls. I tried the police, and they said the accident was closed. I felt helpless. Then how did you get Hope? Daniel looked at the baby with infinite tenderness. A nurse called me 2 months after Lily died. She said a baby girl had been born prematurely in the private medical wing connected to Whitmore Industries. The official records said the baby was stillborn. But this nurse had been there. She knew the baby was alive. She knew they were planning to put her into an adoption system under a false identity. The nurse smuggled the baby out during shift change. She brought Hope to me because Lily had written my name in her personal effects as an emergency contact. Charles felt dizzy. You've been raising my granddaughter for 7 months, and I had no idea she existed. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't come to you. You were surrounded by the same people Lily feared. I couldn't go to the police without proof. All I had was a nurse's story and a baby who wasn't supposed to exist. So I've been working double shifts, keeping my head down, raising Hope as quietly as possible. I bring her here sometimes because I want her to know her mother, even if she can't remember. Hope began to fuss, and Daniel lifted her against his shoulder, patting her back with practiced movements. Charles watched this stranger, this janitor he'd almost had thrown out of the cemetery, caring for his granddaughter with obvious devotion. I need proof, Charles said finally. I need medical records, documents, something concrete. Then get them, Daniel said. You own the hospital. You own the medical research wing. Request Lily's full file. Not the summary Victor provided. The complete file. See what they show you. Charles nodded slowly. If what you're saying is true, if my own company was involved in my daughter's death, then everyone responsible will pay. I promise you that. I don't want revenge, Daniel said quietly. I just want Hope to be safe. I want her to grow up knowing her mother was brave and good. And I want the people who killed Lily to face justice. Those might be the same thing, Charles said grimly. He took one last look at his granddaughter, this impossible child who shouldn't exist, and made a decision. Whatever truth lay buried beneath 3 years of grief and lies, he would unearth it, even if it destroyed everything he'd built, even if it revealed that his empire was built on graves. Because Daniel was right about one thing. Lily had always been brave and good, and she deserved justice, even if it came too late. The conversation at the cemetery had shifted something fundamental between Charles and Daniel. When they met the following morning, Charles arrived with coffee and pastries, a small gesture that acknowledged he no longer saw Daniel as an intruder, but as an unlikely ally. Daniel accepted the offering with quiet gratitude, and they sat together in the grass while Hope played with a soft rattle. I've been thinking about what you said, Charles began. About the timeline. About Lily not being in the car. I need to see proof, but I also need to be smart about how I request information. If Victor is involved in something criminal, I can't let him know I'm investigating. Daniel nodded, adjusting Hope's blanket against the morning chill. What's your plan? I'm going to request Lily's medical files directly from the hospital archive. As her father and next of kin, I have legal right to access them, but I'll frame it as needing closure, something personal. If I approach it like I'm suspicious, they'll sanitize everything before I see it. Do you think they kept records of what really happened? Corporations always keep records, Charles said grimly. They might hide them, bury them in layers of bureaucracy, but they exist. People like Victor believe documentation protects them. They just never expect anyone to look. Before Daniel could respond, Hope made a small whimpering sound. Daniel lifted her gently, and as he shifted her position, the blanket slipped from her shoulder. Charles caught a glimpse of skin and froze. Wait, he said. Can I see her shoulder? Daniel hesitated, protective instinct flickering across his face, but then carefully moved the fabric aside. There, on Hope's tiny shoulder, was a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. The same birthmark Lily had carried in the exact same location. Charles felt his hands begin to shake. Lily had that mark, he whispered, in that exact spot. Her mother used to say it was where the moon goddess kissed her. I know, Daniel said softly. I saw it when I was changing her clothes the first time the nurse brought her to me. That's when I knew for certain this baby was Lily's daughter. Not just because the nurse told me, but because I could see Lily in her. Charles reached out slowly, and Daniel allowed him to touch the birthmark with one finger. The proof was undeniable now. This child was his granddaughter, his flesh and blood. And for 7 months, she had existed without his knowledge while he mourned alone in ignorance. "I'm going to make this right," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to find out what happened to Lily, and I'm going to make sure Hope is protected. I promise you that." "I believe you," Daniel said. "But be careful. If Lily was right about people watching her, they might be watching you too now." Charles left the cemetery with renewed purpose. He went directly to Whitmore Industries headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that bore his family name. His assistant greeted him with surprise since he rarely came to the office anymore, preferring to manage things remotely from his penthouse. "I need access to the medical archive," Charles told her. "Specifically, I need my daughter's complete hospital file from 3 years ago." His assistant's expression shifted to sympathy. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. I'll contact the records department right away. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" "Everything," Charles said. "I want the complete file. Not summaries. Not reports. Every page, every form, every signature." Within an hour, he received a call from the hospital's legal department. A woman with a carefully neutral voice explained that medical records required proper authorization and processing time. Charles, accustomed to immediate compliance with his requests, felt his patience thin. "I'm her father," he said sharply. "I own the hospital. Give me the files today." There was a pause. "Mr. Whitmore, we absolutely understand. However, files from that time period are stored in a secure archive that requires executive clearance. We'll need Mr. Hale to sign off on the release." "Victor Hale." Charles kept his voice even. "Why would the legal department need to approve medical records being released to next of kin? It's standard protocol for any records connected to company executives or their families. Privacy protection measures put in place after the incident. Mr. Hale implemented them personally." Charles felt cold certainty settle over him. Victor had built walls around the truth, and those walls were disguised as protective procedures. "I see. Then contact Victor and get his approval. I want those files by end of business today." "Of course, Mr. Whitmore." But the files didn't arrive that day. Instead, Victor Hale himself appeared at Charles's penthouse that evening, letting himself in with the familiarity of someone who had been given access years ago. He carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of professional concern. "Charles," Victor said, settling into a chair without invitation, "I heard you requested Lily's medical records. I wanted to deliver them personally and make sure you're doing all right. I know anniversaries can be difficult." Charles accepted the portfolio but didn't open it. "I appreciate your concern, Victor. I just felt it was time to review everything properly. I never looked at the details when it happened. I was too devastated." "Completely understandable," Victor said smoothly. "Grief makes it hard to process information. That's why I handled everything for you. I wanted to spare you additional pain. And I'm grateful for that. But I'm ready now. I need to understand exactly what happened to my daughter." Victor's expression remained sympathetic, but Charles noticed tension in his jaw. "Of course. Everything is in that file. Accident report, medical examiner's findings, death certificate. If you have any questions, I'm happy to clarify." Charles opened the portfolio and began reading. The documents looked official and complete. Detailed descriptions of injuries. Toxicology reports showing no alcohol or drugs. Photographs of the accident scene. Everything painted a picture of a tragic single-vehicle accident on a rainy night. But as Charles read more carefully, he began to notice oddities. The medical examiner's signature was dated 2 days after the accident, which seemed standard. But there was another signature below it from Victor's office, dated the same day as the accident. How had legal signed off on findings before the medical examination was complete? "Victor," Charles said carefully, "why does your office have a signature on these documents dated before the medical examiner filed his report?" "Standard preliminary review," Victor said without hesitation. "We needed to begin coordinating with the police and media immediately. The signature just indicates we received initial notification." It sounded plausible, but Charles had spent decades in business learning to spot evasions and half-truths. Victor was too smooth, too prepared. And Lily's personal effects? What happened to her phone, her laptop, her belongings from the car? Destroyed in the accident, unfortunately. The fire was quite severe. There was a fire? Charles flipped through the pages. The accident report doesn't mention fire. Victor's expression flickered for just a moment. A small fire. It's in the supplemental report. Would you like me to get that for you as well? Yes, Charles said. I'd like to see every supplemental report, every photograph, every piece of evidence from the scene. Of course, I'll have my assistant compile everything. Victor stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Charles, I have to ask, why this sudden interest in reviewing everything? Has something prompted these questions? Charles met his gaze steadily. Just a father trying to find peace. You understand. I do, Victor said, but his eyes were calculating. Just remember, sometimes digging into painful memories doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it only brings more pain. After Victor left, Charles examined the files more closely. He found what Daniel had mentioned, sections signed off not by doctors, but by corporate legal. The timeline showed Lily was officially pronounced dead at 2:47 a.m., but Victor's office had already issued a statement to the media at 1:15 a.m. How had they known she was dead before doctors made it official? Charles pulled out his phone and called a private investigator he'd used for corporate matters years ago. I need you to look into something sensitive. Very sensitive. And it needs to be completely off the books. The next morning at the cemetery, Charles showed Daniel what he'd found. They sat in their usual spot while Hope napped on the blanket between them. The timeline is wrong in multiple places, Charles explained. Victor's office was involved before they should have been. And there's a missing ultrasound report. See this placeholder? It references prenatal imaging, but there's no actual image attached. Daniel leaned forward, studying the documents. Prenatal imaging. So they knew she was pregnant. They must have. But they removed the evidence. The question is why? Because a pregnant daughter asking questions about pharmaceutical research is a liability, Daniel said quietly. Lily told me Victor confronted her at the clinic once. She'd gone there during lunch break, and he showed up. She said he knew about the pregnancy, somehow. He told her she was being reckless, that she needed to think about the company's interests, that her condition made her emotional and unreliable. Charles felt rage building in his chest. He threatened her. She thought so. That's when she started making plans to leave the city. She was terrified, Charles. Not just worried, genuinely afraid. Charles closed the file. I'm moving you and hope somewhere safe. Today, I have a guest house on a property outside the city. It has security, gates, everything you'll need. You can't stay in your apartment anymore. If Victor knows I'm asking questions, he might start looking into who else might know the truth. Daniel started to protest, but Charles held up a hand. This isn't negotiable. That baby is my granddaughter, and you're the only person who protected her when everyone else either didn't know or didn't care. I'm not letting anything happen to either of you. What about your company? Won't people notice if you suddenly move a janitor into your guest house? I don't care what people notice, Charles said firmly. Let them talk. Let them wonder. My daughter is dead, and my granddaughter has been hidden from me for 7 months. I'm done worrying about appearances. Daniel moved into the guest house that afternoon with nothing but a small bag of clothes and Hope's essentials. The property sat on 15 acres, surrounded by stone walls and monitored by private security Charles had hired years ago. Daniel walked through rooms larger than his entire apartment, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from struggling to survive to being surrounded by wealth. I don't belong here, he said quietly as Charles showed him the nursery he'd had prepared in just hours. You belong wherever Hope is safe, Charles replied. And right now, this is the safest place I can offer. That night, Charles sat in the nursery watching his granddaughter sleep in a proper crib for what Daniel admitted was the first time in her life. Hope's tiny chest rose and fell with peaceful breaths, and Charles felt 7 months of missed moments crash over him. First smiles he'd never seen. First laughs he'd never heard. A whole beginning of a life that had been stolen from him. She has Lily's expressions, Charles whispered to Daniel, who stood in the doorway. The way her eyebrows furrow when she's concentrating. Lily did that even as a baby. She's gonna have questions someday, Daniel said. about her mother, about why things happened the way they did. I want to have good answers for her. Then we find the truth, Charles said. Whatever it takes. The next morning, Charles's private investigator called with preliminary findings. Mr. Whitmore, I've looked into the accident scene from 3 years ago. I pulled traffic camera footage from that night, using some contacts in the police department. You need to see this. An hour later, Charles and Daniel sat in the guest house study, watching grainy footage on a laptop. The timestamp showed 11:34 p.m., the night Lily supposedly died. The camera captured the intersection near where her car eventually went off the road. Watch carefully, the investigator said, pointing at the screen. That's your daughter's vehicle passing through the intersection at 11:34, heading north, away from River Road, not toward it. Charles leaned closer. The car's license plate was clearly visible. It was definitely Lily's vehicle. Now watch this. The investigator continued, fast-forwarding. Same intersection, 11:52 p.m. 18 minutes later, the same car appeared again, this time traveling south, back toward River Road. But something was different. Look at the driver, Daniel said suddenly. Charles squinted at the footage. The figure behind the wheel was larger than Lily, broader in the shoulders. Definitely male. Someone else was driving her car, Charles said, his voice hollow. Someone drove her car to the accident site and staged the crash. It gets worse, the investigator said. I checked hospital admissions from that night at every facility within 50 miles. There's no record of Lily Whitmore being admitted anywhere. But I found something interesting at the Whitmore Industries Medical Research Center. A Jane Doe was admitted at 11:47 p.m. Young female, pregnant, critical condition. She was taken directly to the private surgical wing. The same wing where Hope was supposedly stillborn, Daniel added. Can you get those Jane Doe records? Charles asked. The investigator shook his head. They're sealed under medical privacy laws, and they require executive authorization to access. But here's what I can tell you. That Jane Doe was admitted under the authorization of Victor Hale. He signed the intake paperwork personally. Charles felt pieces clicking together into a horrifying picture. Victor had orchestrated everything. The fake accident, the hidden admission, the covered-up pregnancy. All of it designed to erase Lily's questions about pharmaceutical fraud and eliminate any leverage she might have had. There's one person who might be able to confirm this, Daniel said slowly. The nurse who brought Hope to me. Her name is Patricia Morris. She worked in the private wing, but quit 6 months after everything happened. She told me she couldn't live with what she'd witnessed. Where is she now? Charles asked. Living in a retirement community about an hour from here. I have her number. She made me promise to call if anything ever threatened Hope. Charles stood. Call her. Tell her we need to talk. Patricia Morris agreed to meet them that evening at a small diner far from the city. She was a woman in her late 60s with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly as she stirred her coffee. When Daniel introduced Charles, her face went pale. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, I never thought I'd meet you. I'm so sorry for what happened to your daughter. Tell me what you saw. Charles said gently. Please, I need to know the truth. Patricia took a shaky breath. They brought her in unconscious. She was in premature labor, maybe 7 months along. I was assigned to assist, but everything was strange. No standard admission. No regular doctors. Just specialists brought in by Mr. Hale. What happened during the delivery? It was difficult. She was in distress. They performed an emergency cesarean. The baby was small but alive, breathing, crying. I held her while they worked on your daughter. Patricia's voice broke. Lily woke up during recovery, just for a few minutes. She asked if the baby was okay. I told her yes. She smiled and said to tell Daniel the baby's name was Hope. Then she coded. Charles gripped the table edge. She died during recovery? They said she had complications from the surgery. Internal bleeding they couldn't control. But I've been a labor and delivery nurse for 40 years, Mr. Whitmore. What I saw didn't look like surgical complications. It looked like she'd been given something. Her symptoms were all wrong. You think they killed her? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I think she was sedated too heavily. I think someone made sure she didn't wake up again. And then they declared the baby stillborn, even though I could hear her crying in the next room. They told me to forget what I'd seen. They offered me early retirement with a generous package. I took it because I was scared, but I couldn't let that baby disappear completely. So I found Daniel's number in Lily's personal things and brought Hope to him. Do you have any proof of this? Charles asked. Patricia reached in her purse and pulled out a USB drive. I made copies of the intake forms before I left. I know I could lose my license for this, maybe face legal charges. But that young woman trusted me to help her, and I failed her. I won't fail her daughter. Charles took the drive with shaking hands. You didn't fail anyone, Patricia. You saved my granddaughter's life. They returned to the guest house with the files, and Charles spent hours reviewing documents that painted a damning picture. Lily admitted under a false name. Victor's signature on every authorization. Medications administered that had no clear medical purpose. And a birth certificate that declared baby girl Doe deceased, signed by a doctor Charles had never heard of. This is murder, Charles said finally. Corporate murder covered up with paperwork and money. Daniel sat with Hope sleeping in his arms, looking devastated. What do we do now? Before Charles could answer, his phone rang. The security chief from the guest house. Mr. Whitmore, we've had a breach attempt. Someone tried to access the property through the east gate. We detained them, but I think you should get down here. Charles and Daniel rushed to the security office. On the monitors, they could see a man in a dark suit being held by two guards. Charles recognized him immediately. Marcus Webb, Victor's personal assistant. What was he doing? Charles demanded. Trying to enter using old access codes, the security chief said. Codes that should have been deactivated years ago. He had a tablet with blueprints of the property and the guest house specifically. Charles felt ice in his veins. They know Hope is here. He called his head of security immediately. I need armed protection at the guest house around the clock. No one enters or leaves without my personal authorization. No exceptions. Daniel's face had gone ashen. We can't stay here. If they found us this quickly, they'll try again. You're safer here than anywhere else, Charles insisted. This property is a fortress. But you're right that we're running out of time. We need to move faster. Charles returned to the main house and made a decision that would change everything. He called his board of directors and scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. Then he called the FBI field office and requested a meeting with their white-collar crime division. When he returned to check on Daniel and Hope before dawn, he found the guest house empty. The front door stood open. Signs of a struggle marked the hallway. And on the kitchen table, a note written in Victor's handwriting. Come alone to the old research wing if you want to see your granddaughter again. You have 2 hours. Charles stood in the empty room where Hope had slept safely just hours before, and something inside him transformed. The grief that had paralyzed him for 3 years crystallized into cold, focused rage. They had taken his daughter. Now, they had taken his granddaughter. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had given him a reason to burn everything down. And Charles Whitmore, when properly motivated, was very good at destruction. He made one phone call to his private security team, one to his attorney, and one to the FBI agent who had agreed to meet with him. Then he drove toward the old research wing alone, knowing that whatever happened next would end with either justice or devastation. Either way, Victor Hale's empire of secrets was about to collapse. Charles drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward the abandoned medical research wing, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The building loomed ahead like a monument to corruption, its windows dark and empty. This was the same facility where Lily had volunteered years ago, where she had discovered the truth that sealed her fate. Victor had shut it down 18 months after Lily's death, claiming budget cuts. Now Charles understood it had been about erasing evidence. He parked in an empty lot and stepped out into the cold morning air. The building stood silent, but Charles knew Victor was inside waiting. He had come alone as instructed, but he wasn't stupid. His security team was positioned 3 blocks away, and the FBI had been given the address with instructions to move in if Charles didn't check in within the hour. He had also forwarded all of Patricia's documents to his attorney with instructions to release everything to the media if anything happened to him. The front entrance was unlocked. Charles pushed through and found himself in a lobby thick with dust and shadows. Emergency lighting cast everything in a sickly red glow. His footsteps echoed against tile floors as he moved deeper into the building, following signs toward the research wing. "I'm impressed you came," Victor's voice called from somewhere ahead. "I wasn't certain you valued the child enough to risk yourself." Charles followed the voice to what had once been a conference room. Victor stood near the windows, immaculately dressed despite the early hour. He looked calm, almost amused, as if this were just another business negotiation. "Where are they?" Charles demanded. "Safe. For now." Victor gestured to a chair. "Seat. We have things to discuss. I'm not here to negotiate with you. I'm here to get my granddaughter and Daniel back. And you will. But first, you need to understand the position you've put yourself in." Victor pulled a tablet from his briefcase and tapped the screen. "You've been asking questions, requesting files, meeting with retired nurses. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" "I wanted you to notice," Charles said coldly. "I wanted you to know I was coming for you." Victor laughed, a sound devoid of warmth, still playing the powerful billionaire. "But you're not powerful here, Charles. Not anymore. You see, everything you've discovered, every piece of evidence you think you have, it all points to corporate malfeasance. Pharmaceutical fraud, manipulated trials. But none of it directly implicates me personally. You killed my daughter. I managed a liability," Victor corrected. "Your daughter was brilliant but naive. She discovered that our clinical trials for a revolutionary medication had been accelerated by omitting certain adverse reactions. Do you know how much money was invested in that drug? How many contracts depended on FDA approval? Lily was going to destroy billions in shareholder value because of her misguided sense of ethics." Charles felt rage burning through him. She was right. People could have been harmed by that medication. Some people were harmed, Victor said casually, but many more benefited. That's the calculus of pharmaceutical business. You understood that once, before grief made you soft. I never understood murdering my own daughter to protect profit margins. Victor's expression hardened. Lily made her choice when she became pregnant. The timing was catastrophically bad. We just received FDA approval. The drug was set to launch. Then your daughter decides to have a baby and potentially take maternity leave, which would trigger mandatory disclosures about her concerns if she formally stepped away from the division. The pregnancy made her uncontrollable, so you staged an accident and killed her during childbirth. I arranged for her to receive care in a secure environment where her concerns could be managed properly. Her death was genuinely unfortunate. Complications happened during emergency cesareans, but the child needed to be eliminated from the record. A Whitmore heir with genetic ties to Lily would have created endless complications. Questions about inheritance, about who knew what and when. Much cleaner to declare the baby stillborn. Except the baby wasn't stillborn. Hope is alive. Yes, that was an unfortunate oversight. Patricia Morris was always too sentimental for surgical nursing. She should have been terminated years earlier. Victor set down the tablet. But we can still correct that mistake. The child disappears. You go back to mourning your daughter. And Whitmore Industries continues to thrive under my leadership. Your leadership? Charles asked. Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything I've built? I've been running this company for years while you wallowed in grief. The board trusts me. The shareholders love me. You're just a grieving figurehead who signs whatever I put in front of you. Charles felt the full weight of his failure crash over him. Victor was right. He had been absent, consumed by loss, letting others make decisions. He had built an empire and then abandoned it to people who saw only profit and power. I'm not letting you take hope, Charles said quietly. You don't have a choice. Before Victor could continue, the emergency lighting flickered, then went completely dark. Charles heard Victor curse in the blackness. Then a new voice called out from somewhere in the building. Actually, he does have a choice. Daniel's voice. Emergency generators kicked in, bringing the red lighting back in pulses. Charles saw movement in the hallway. Daniel appeared, carrying Hope wrapped securely against his chest. Behind him was a man Charles recognized as Marcus Blake, the former head of security Victor had fired 2 years ago. Marcus, Charles said, stunned. Mr. Whitmore. Marcus nodded. Daniel contacted me yesterday, told me what was happening. I've been wanting to take Victor down for years. He fired me when I started asking questions about the medical wing's private admissions. Victor's composure finally cracked. How did you get out? Your people are good at intimidation, Daniel said calmly. But they're not good at watching multiple exits. Marcus knew this building's layout. We've been waiting for Charles to arrive. Victor moved toward an emergency exit, but Marcus blocked his path. Not this time. You're going to answer for what you did to Lily. You have no proof of anything, Victor snarled. It's just accusations and conspiracy theories. Actually, we have quite a bit of proof, another voice said from the main entrance. Charles turned to see FBI agent Rebecca Chun walking in with 4 agents behind her. She held up a warrant. Victor Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and felony murder. Victor's face went white. You can't charge me with murder. There's no evidence. Patricia Morris's testimony combined with the medical records she provided gives us probable cause, Agent Chin said. And Mr. Whitmore's investigator found security footage from this facility showing you personally administering medications to Lily Whitmore during her surgery. Medications she wasn't prescribed. Medications that contributed to her death. Charles stared at Victor. You were there? You were in the operating room. I was protecting the company, Victor said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Everything I did was for Whitmore Industries. You killed my daughter, Charles said, and his voice broke. You murdered her to hide pharmaceutical fraud and protect your own position. Lily was weak, Victor spat. She couldn't see the bigger picture. She would have destroyed everything out of misguided morality. Marcus stepped forward and drove his fist into Victor's face. The impact sent Victor sprawling to the floor, blood streaming from his nose. 2 FBI agents immediately restrained Marcus, but Agent Shin didn't look particularly upset by the assault. That's for Lily, Marcus said quietly. As agents handcuffed Victor and read him his rights, Charles walked to Daniel and Hope. The baby was crying softly, confused by all the noise and chaos. Charles reached out tentatively, and Daniel shifted Hope so Charles could see her face clearly. She's okay, Daniel said. They held us in the old lab, but they didn't hurt her. I wouldn't have let them. Charles touched Hope's tiny hand, and she gripped his finger instinctively. The simple gesture broke something inside him. All the years of distance from Lily, all the missed opportunities to know his daughter, they all condensed into this moment. But here was a second chance. A granddaughter who needed protection, who needed family, who needed someone to choose her over empires and profit. Thank you, Charles whispered to Daniel. Thank you for protecting her when I didn't even know she existed. You know now, Daniel said simply. That's what matters. Agent Chin approached them. Mr. Whitmore, we'll need statements from all of you. But I want you to know that the evidence you've gathered is substantial. Combined with what we've been investigating independently regarding Whitmore Industries' pharmaceutical practices, we have a strong case against Mr. Hale and several other executives. Other executives? Charles asked. Your company's fraud goes deeper than Victor Hale. Multiple department heads were involved in manipulating clinical trial data. We've been building a case for 8 months, but we needed someone on the inside willing to cooperate. Your coming forward accelerated our timeline significantly. Charles looked back at Victor, who was being led away in handcuffs. 3 years ago, this man had stood beside him at Lily's funeral, offering condolences while knowing he had orchestrated her death. The betrayal was almost incomprehensible. What happens now? Charles asked. Now we investigate, Agent Shin said, and you prepare for your company to face significant legal consequences. The next 72 hours felt like years compressed into days. Charles returned to Whitmore Industries headquarters and called an emergency board meeting. The conference room filled with executives who had no idea their world was about to collapse. Charles stood at the head of the table and told them everything. The pharmaceutical fraud, Lily's murder, Victor's arrest, the FBI investigation. Silence followed his words, heavy and suffocating. Then chaos erupted. Board members demanded to see evidence. Legal counsel argued about liability. The CFO immediately began calculating financial exposure. Charles watched them scramble to protect themselves and felt nothing but disgust. "I'm cooperating fully with federal investigators," Charles announced. "I'm handing over all internal documents related to our pharmaceutical division. Every trial, every approval process, every communication. If there's fraud in this company, I want it exposed. That will destroy us," the CFO protested. "Our stock price will collapse. We'll face lawsuits from patients, shareholders, everyone." "Good," Charles said flatly. "We deserve to be destroyed if this is what we've become." The news broke that afternoon. Major outlets ran stories about the FBI raid on Whitmore Industries and Victor Hale's arrest. By evening, the story had evolved to include details about Lily's death and the hidden granddaughter. Charles's phone exploded with calls from journalists, investors, and former associates. He ignored them all. Instead, he sat in the guest house with Daniel and Hope, watching his granddaughter play with a soft toy. The contrast between the chaos outside and the peace in this room felt surreal. Everything he had built was crumbling, yet he felt more grounded than he had in years. "The media found out about Hope," Daniel said quietly, showing Charles his phone. Headlines screamed about secret heirs and corporate conspiracies. "I'm sorry," Charles said. "You didn't ask for this attention. Neither did Hope. But we'll deal with it." Daniel picked up the baby and held her protectively. "What I'm worried about is what happens legally. To Hope, I mean. Am I still her guardian? Do you want custody? How does this work?" "Charles, I've been thinking about that question since the rescue. Lily made your choice. She trusted you to protect Hope when she couldn't. I'm not going to override that trust. But I'd like to be part of Hope's life. As her grandfather, if you'll allow it." "Of course," Daniel said, relief evident in his voice. "Hope deserves to know her family. Both sides of her family. But I need to know you understand something important." "What's that?" "I'm not giving her up. I've raised her for 7 months. I've been up with her every night. I've changed every diaper and calmed every cry. I love her like she's my own daughter. So if you're thinking about using your money and lawyers to take her from me, we're going to have a problem." Charles looked at this man who had given everything to protect a child that wasn't biologically his and felt profound respect. "I would never do that to you or to Hope. You're her father in every way that matters. I just want to be her grandfather, to tell her stories about Lily, to make sure she knows she comes from love, even though her beginning was surrounded by tragedy." Daniel's shoulders relaxed. "Then we figure this out together. For her sake." 2 days later, the media circus intensified when DNA results were leaked confirming Hope was Lily's biological daughter. Charles suspected someone from the FBI investigation had provided the information to the press, though it didn't matter at this point. The truth was public now. Daniel was photographed leaving the guest house with Hope, and suddenly his face was everywhere. News outlets ran stories calling him a hero. Social media erupted with support for the janitor who had protected a billionaire's secret granddaughter. Strangers sent gifts and letters. It was overwhelming. Then Victor's legal team went on the offensive. They leaked manipulated stories to sympathetic journalists, painting Daniel as an opportunist who had kidnapped Hope and extorted Charles. They claimed the baby had been legally declared stillborn and that Daniel had stolen her from the hospital. They suggested he was using the child to access Whitmore wealth. The accusations cut deep. Daniel read the articles with growing horror, watching his name get destroyed in real time. Charles immediately held a press conference to refute every claim. "Daniel Freeman saved my granddaughter's life," Charles said into a forest of microphones. "While I was being deceived about my daughter's death, while executives in my own company were covering up murder, Daniel was raising Hope with love and devotion. He's not an opportunist. He's a hero, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me personally." The press conference helped, but damage had been done. Protesters appeared outside Whitmore Industries, demanding justice for Lily. Shareholders filed lawsuits. The company's stock price dropped 30% in a single day. Board members began resigning to distance themselves from the scandal. Charles watched his empire disintegrate and felt no regret. This is what should happen when a company loses its way. This is what accountability looked like. The FBI investigation expanded rapidly. Agents discovered that the fraudulent pharmaceutical practices went back years before Lily's involvement. Multiple drugs had been rushed to market with manipulated safety data. Some patients had suffered serious adverse reactions. A few had died. The scope of criminality was staggering. Victor's arrest led to 8 more. Department heads, research directors, compliance officers who had looked the other way. Charles learned that people he'd trusted for decades had been systematically lying to him, treating the company as their personal profit machine while he'd been too absent to notice. Patricia Morris was brought in to testify before a grand jury. Her detailed account of what happened during Lily's delivery was devastating. She described Victor entering the operating room after the cesarean, dismissing the attending physicians, and personally administering sedatives that caused Lily's respiratory failure. She had been too frightened to report it at the time, but she had documented everything in private notes. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" the prosecutor asked during her testimony. "Because I was terrified," Patricia answered honestly. "Victor Hale threatened my pension, my nursing license, my family. He made it clear that speaking out would destroy my life. So I took his money and stayed quiet. But I couldn't let that baby disappear. That was the line I wouldn't cross." Her testimony was enough. The grand jury indicted Victor Hale on first-degree murder charges along with conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction. The prosecutors announced they would seek life imprisonment without parole. Charles attended every hearing. He sat in the courtroom watching the man who had been his trusted advisor for 15 years face the consequences of his actions. Victor's lawyers argued that Lily's death was an unfortunate medical complication, that Victor had only been trying to manage a difficult situation, that there was no intent to kill. The jury didn't believe them. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Witnesses testified about the pharmaceutical fraud, about pressure to manipulate data, about Victor's ruthless management style. Patricia described the operating room in painful detail. The medical examiner explained how the sedatives Victor administered had caused fatal respiratory depression. Daniel testified about Lily's fears in her final months, about her desperate attempts to protect her unborn child. Charles took the stand and spoke about his daughter, about losing her twice, first to distance and corporate pressure, then to murder, about the granddaughter he never knew existed, about trusting the wrong people and failing to protect his family. When the verdict came back, the courtroom was packed. Guilty on all counts. Victor Hale showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Multiple executives received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. Charles stood as Victor was led away in chains. Their eyes met briefly, and Charles felt no satisfaction in the moment. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring Lily back. It couldn't restore the 3 years Hope had lived without her grandfather. It couldn't undo the empire built on lies and covered in blood. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Charles, asking how he felt about the verdict. He gave a brief statement expressing gratitude for the justice system and respect for the jury's decision. Then he pushed through the crowd to where Daniel waited with Hope. The baby had grown in the months since the investigation began. She was sitting up now, reaching for things, making sounds that almost formed words. She smiled when she saw Charles, and he felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. "It's over," Daniel said quietly. "The trial is over," Charles agreed. "But we still have work to do. Victims of those fraudulent drugs need compensation. Lily's memory needs to be honored properly, and Hope needs a childhood free from scandal and trauma. How do we do all that?" Daniel asked. "Together," Charles said. "We do it together." They walked away from the courthouse, away from the cameras and questions, away from the wreckage of Whitmore Industries. Hope babbled happily in Daniel's arms, innocent of the darkness that had surrounded her birth. Charles watched her tiny hands wave in the air and made a silent promise. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she grew up knowing she was loved, that her mother had been brave and good, that justice, though delayed, could still prevail, and that family wasn't defined by blood alone, but by who showed up when it mattered most. The war inside the empire was over. Now came the harder work of building something better from the ruins. 3 months after Victor's conviction, Charles stood in the ruins of what had been his corporate headquarters. Whitmore Industries was being systematically dismantled. Assets were being sold to pay settlements to victims of the fraudulent pharmaceuticals. The building itself would soon be demolished, making way for a public park. It felt appropriate somehow, turning the monument to corporate greed into something that served the community. Daniel found him there, standing alone in the empty lobby. Hope was with a babysitter, giving them time to handle the final pieces of business. The building echoed with their footsteps as Daniel approached. "Marcus called," Daniel said. "He found something at the old clinic. Says we need to see it immediately." They drove to what remained of the community clinic where Lily had volunteered years ago. The building had been condemned and was scheduled for demolition next month. Marcus Blake waited outside, holding a crowbar and wearing a determined expression. "The construction crew called me," Marcus explained. "They found a wall that sounded hollow. Thought there might be asbestos or something dangerous. But when they opened it up, they found this." He led them inside to what had been an examination room. A section of drywall had been removed, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a waterproof bag containing a flash drive and a sealed envelope. "Lily," Daniel whispered, recognizing the hiding spot immediately. "She told me once that if anything happened, there was something hidden here. I searched but never found it. The wall must have been repaired after she hid this." Charles took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written across the front in Lily's handwriting. He hadn't seen her writing in 3 years, and the sight of it made his throat tighten. "Should I open it now?" Charles asked quietly. "Only if you're ready," Daniel said gently. Charles broke the seal and pulled out a letter. Lily's words filled 2 pages, written in the careful script she'd learned as a child. "Dad," it began, "if you're reading this, something has gone very wrong. I hope I'm being paranoid. I hope I'll retrieve this letter someday and laugh about how scared I was. But if I'm right, if the people I fear are as dangerous as I think, then you need to know the truth." Charles's hands shook as he continued reading. Lily detailed everything she discovered about the pharmaceutical fraud. Names, dates, specific drugs that had been rushed through approval with manipulated data. She described Victor's threats, his increasingly aggressive attempts to silence her questions. She wrote about the pregnancy, about her fear that the baby would be used against her, or worse, eliminated to remove complications. "I know I've disappointed you," the letter continued. "I know you wanted me to embrace the company, to carry on the Whitmore legacy. But I can't be part of something that hurts people for profit. I can't raise a child in a world built on lies. If something happens to me, please protect my baby. And please, Dad, burn all down, every corrupt piece of that empire. Don't let my death be used to protect the people who caused it." The letter ended with words that broke Charles completely. "I love you. I always have. I'm sorry I couldn't be the daughter you wanted, but I hope you can forgive me for being the daughter I needed to be. Tell my child about me someday. Tell them I tried to do what was right, even when it was hard. Love always, Lily." Charles sat down heavily on the floor, the letter clutched in his hands. Tears streamed down his face as years of grief and guilt crashed over him. Daniel knelt beside him, not saying anything, just being present in the moment. "She asked me to burn it down," Charles said through his tears. "And I did. But I should have done it while she was alive. I should have listened to her concerns instead of dismissing them as inexperience." "You didn't know," Daniel said quietly. "I should have known. I was her father. I should have protected her." Marcus stood nearby, his own eyes wet. "She was braver than any of us. She knew what she was risking, and she stood up anyway." Charles wiped his face and looked at the flash drive. "What's on this?" "Only one way to find out," Marcus said. They went to Marcus's apartment and loaded the drive onto his computer. It contained dozens of files, recorded phone calls, email chains, video diaries. Lily had documented everything with meticulous care, creating a trail of evidence that was now damning even beyond what the FBI had already uncovered. The video diaries were the hardest to watch. Lily had recorded them over several months, sitting in her apartment late at night, speaking directly to the camera. Her fear was palpable in early videos, growing more pronounced as time went on. In one video dated 3 weeks before her death, Lily sat with her hands resting on her pregnant belly. I felt the baby kick today for the first time, she said softly. It made everything real. I'm going to be a mother. And that means I have to be brave enough to fight for the kind of world I want my child to grow up in, even if it costs me everything. Another video showed her crying, explaining how Victor had cornered her in a parking garage. He didn't threaten me directly, she said, but he talked about how accidents happen, how pregnant women are vulnerable, how the company has resources to handle problems quietly. I'm terrified, but I can't back down now. Too many people have been hurt by what we've done. The final video was recorded the day before she died. Lily looked exhausted but determined. I've copied everything to this drive, and I'm hiding it tomorrow at the clinic. If something happens to me, this evidence will survive. I've also named Daniel Freeman as my emergency contact and asked him to care for my baby if anything goes wrong. Dad, if you're watching this, I need you to know something important. Lily paused, seeming to gather her courage. I forgave you a long time ago for being absent, for prioritizing work over our relationship, for all the missed calls and canceled dinners. I understand now that you were doing what you thought was right, just like I'm doing what I think is right. We're not so different, you and me. We're both stubborn, and we both believe in fighting for what matters. I just hope my fight means something. I hope the baby gets to grow up safe and loved. And I hope you find peace somehow, even if I'm not there to help you find it. The video ended with Lily looking directly at the camera, her expression soft and sad. I love you, Dad. Tell my baby about me. Tell them I tried. Charles watched the screen go black and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For 3 years, he had carried guilt like a stone around his neck. Guilt for unanswered calls, for distance, for failing to protect his daughter. But Lily's words released him from that burden. She had forgiven him. She had understood him, and she had asked him to do something specific with her death. Make it mean something. We need to release these, Charles said quietly. All of it. The letter, the videos, everything. The world needs to see what Lily was fighting for. Are you sure? Daniel asked. Once this is public, it'll restart all the media attention. Hope will grow up with these videos available online. She'll see her mother's fear, her pain. She'll also see her mother's courage, Charles said firmly. She'll see a woman who stood up against corruption, even when it meant risking everything. That's a legacy worth preserving. The release of Lily's recordings sparked a national conversation. News outlets ran extensive coverage of her video diaries. Her words were quoted in congressional hearings about pharmaceutical industry oversight. Universities invited ethicists to analyze her case as an example of moral courage in corporate settings. Lily became a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. But for Charles and Daniel, the most important impact was personal. Hope was too young to understand what was happening, but someday she would watch those videos and see her mother. She would hear Lily's voice, see her smile, understand the choices she made and why she made them. Federal hearings expanded based on Lily's evidence. Several other pharmaceutical companies were investigated for similar practices. New regulations were passed requiring independent oversight of clinical trials. Lily's death had exposed a systemic problem, and the system was finally beginning to change. Charles testified before Congress about what he'd learned. He spoke about corporate culture that prioritized profit over safety, about executives who viewed ethics as obstacles to overcome, about the devastating consequences of unchecked power. His testimony was brutally honest about his own failures as a leader and father. I built an empire, he told the Senate committee, but I didn't pay attention to the foundation it was built on. I trusted the wrong people and ignored warning signs because addressing them was inconvenient. My daughter paid for those failures with her life. I'm here to make sure her death wasn't in vain. The hearings lasted 3 weeks. By the end, sweeping reforms had been proposed for the pharmaceutical industry. Lily's name was attached to several bills aimed at protecting whistleblowers and requiring transparency in clinical trials. Patricia Morris was given immunity for her testimony and publicly praised for her role in protecting hope. She appeared on national news programs, describing the moral injury of remaining silent and the redemption of finally speaking truth. She received thousands of letters from nurses around the country who had faced similar ethical dilemmas. Daniel handled the attention with quiet grace. He gave a few interviews, always steering the conversation back to Lily and away from himself. He described her kindness, her intelligence, her fierce commitment to doing what was right. He made sure the world understood that Lily Whitmore was more than a victim or a symbol. She had been a complete person with dreams and fears and love to give. 6 months after Victor's conviction, Charles made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced the formation of the Lily Whitmore Foundation, funded by the liquidation of his remaining assets. The foundation would provide free legal representation to corporate whistleblowers and fund independent drug safety research. All of Charles's wealth, except what was set aside for Hope's future, would go into this work. "I don't need billions anymore," Charles told reporters at the announcement. "I need purpose. I need to honor my daughter's memory by continuing the fight she started. This foundation will make sure other people who discover dangerous corporate practices have protection and support." Daniel stood beside him at the press conference, holding Hope. The baby was almost a year old now, babbling and pointing at the cameras with delighted confusion. When reporters asked Daniel about his role in the foundation, he smiled. "I'm Hope's dad," he said simply. "That's my role. Charles is handling the foundation. I'm handling making sure this little girl grows up happy and safe and loved. We're all doing what we're best at." The statement was perfect in its simplicity. It defined their relationship clearly. Co-parents working together for Hope's well-being, not competitors fighting for control or credit. The media loved the story of the billionaire and the janitor united by love for a child neither had expected to raise. But away from cameras and public statements, the reality was more complex and more beautiful. Charles and Daniel had built a genuine friendship forged through shared trauma and shared purpose. They had dinner together twice a week. Charles babysat when Daniel needed time to himself. Daniel listened when Charles struggled with guilt or grief. They were family, not through blood but through choice. On the first anniversary of Victor's arrest, Charles and Daniel returned to the cemetery with Hope. They stood at Lily's grave in the early morning, just as Charles had done alone for years before everything changed. Hope toddled unsteadily between the two men, holding both their hands. She was walking now, constantly exploring the world with fearless curiosity. She had Lily's smile and Lily's inquisitive nature. Watching her made Charles's heart ache and soar simultaneously. "Your mama was the bravest person I ever knew," Daniel said to Hope, kneeling beside her at the grave. "She fought for what was right even when it was scary. And she loved you so much, even before you were born." Hope touched the gravestone with one tiny hand, tracing the carved letters of her mother's name. Charles knelt on her other side, completing the circle around Lily's resting place. "I'm sorry I failed you," Charles said quietly to Lily, "but I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to be the father you needed, even if I can only do it now by being the grandfather Hope needs. Your daughter is beautiful and loved and safe. I promise you that." Hope looked up at Charles with wide eyes and said her newest word clearly, "Papa." It was what she'd started calling Charles a month ago, her own invention for distinguishing between her two fathers. Daniel was Dad, Charles was Papa, and somehow, in the complexity of their unconventional family, it worked perfectly. "Yeah, baby girl," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "Papa's here." They spent an hour at the grave, telling Hope stories about Lily. How she used to sit under this very tree when she needed to think. How she volunteered at clinics, helping people who couldn't afford health care. How she stood up to powerful people because she believed truth mattered more than comfort. Hope wouldn't remember this visit, wouldn't understand the words they spoke. But someday she would. Someday they would bring her back here, and she would ask questions, and they would answer honestly. They would tell her about the good and the bad, about her mother's courage and her grandfather's failures, about Daniel's devotion and Victor's evil. They would give her the complete truth, trusting her to understand nuance and complexity. As they prepared to leave, Daniel placed flowers on a grave. Charles added his own bouquet, and Hope, with help, placed a single yellow dandelion she'd picked from the grass. "Mama," Hope said, patting the gravestone one more time. "That's right," Daniel said gently. "That's your mama, and she would be so proud of you." 18 months after the trial, Charles stood in the lobby of what had once been Whitmore Industries and was now the Lily Whitmore Community Healthcare Center. The building had been completely renovated, transformed from corporate monument into a place of healing. Free medical services, mental health counseling, addiction treatment, everything Lily had believed healthcare should be. Daniel worked here now, not as a janitor, but as the center's patient advocate. He helped people navigate the system, connecting them with services and making sure no one fell through the cracks. It was work he was naturally gifted at, having spent years in spaces where people were overlooked and dismissed. He understood the invisible better than most. Hope attended the center's daycare while Daniel worked. She was almost 2 now, full of energy and endless questions. Charles visited 3 times a week, spending hours playing with his granddaughter and occasionally giving guest lectures to medical students about corporate ethics and accountability. The foundation Charles had created was thriving. They'd helped protect 17 whistleblowers in various industries, providing legal support and financial assistance while their cases worked through the system. 3 major pharmaceutical companies had been forced to recall dangerous drugs based on evidence the foundation helped bring to light. Lily's legacy was growing, touching lives she would never meet. Patricia Morris worked part-time at the center, training younger nurses in patient advocacy and ethical practice. She had become something of a hero in nursing circles, speaking at conferences about the importance of speaking truth even when institutions demand silence. She and Daniel had developed a warm friendship, bonded by their shared history and commitment to Hope's well-being. Marcus Blake ran security for both the center and the foundation. He'd found purpose in protecting people who challenge powerful interests, using his skills to keep whistleblowers safe from retaliation. He visited Hope regularly, having become something like an uncle in their unconventional extended family. Charles had sold his penthouse and most of his possessions. He lived in a modest apartment near the center, walking to work most days. The billionaire who had once commanded corporate empires now spent his time reviewing grant applications and meeting with advocacy groups. His wealth was nearly gone, converted into something that served others rather than elevated himself. He was happier than he'd been in decades. On a Tuesday afternoon in spring, Charles picked up Hope from daycare. They had a tradition of visiting the cemetery on Tuesdays when weather allowed. Hope looked forward to these trips now, calling them visiting Mama's tree. The old oak spread its branches wide over Lily's grave, exactly as it had 3 years ago when Charles first found Daniel crying here. But everything else had changed. The grave was surrounded by flowers now, not just from family, but from strangers who had been moved by Lily's story. People left notes thanking her for her courage. Students doing reports on ethical business practices came to pay respects. The grave that had once been lonely and isolated had become a pilgrimage site for people who believed in fighting for what was right. Hope ran ahead on sturdy toddler legs, making a beeline for her favorite spot under the tree. Charles followed more slowly, carrying a blanket and snacks for their afternoon visit. "Mama," Hope announced, patting the gravestone in greeting. "That's right, sweetheart. We're here to visit Mama." They spread the blanket, and Hope immediately started pulling toys from the bag Charles had packed. She was at the age where independent play was interspersed with demands for attention, and Charles had learned to simply be present, letting her direct their time together. "Tell Mama's story," Hope demanded, looking up at Charles with Lily's exact expression of earnest curiosity. "Which story do you want to hear today?" "Brave story." Charles settled against the tree trunk, and Hope climbed into his lap. This had become their ritual. He would tell stories about Lily's bravery, framing them in language a toddler could understand. "Your mama worked at a big building where people made medicine," Charles began. "Medicine is supposed to help people feel better when they're sick. But some of the people at your mama's work were making medicine wrong. They were hurrying too fast and not checking if it was safe." "That's bad," Hope said solemnly. This part of the story never changed, and she knew her lines. "Yes, that's bad. So your mama decided to tell the truth about it, even though the people making the bad medicine didn't want her to. They told her to be quiet. They said she would get in trouble if she kept asking questions. But your mama was very brave. She said that helping people was more important than staying quiet. Mama brave, Hope agreed. The bravest, Charles confirmed. And because your mama told the truth, lots of people were kept safe. Doctors now check medicine more carefully to make sure it's good. Your mama helped change the world to make it better. Hope considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. I'd be brave too. Charles felt his heart squeeze. You already are brave. You're curious and kind, and you always want to help people. Those are all brave things. Like Mama. Just like Mama. Daniel arrived an hour later, joining them under the tree. He'd brought dinner from a food truck nearby, and they had an impromptu picnic on the blanket. Hope divided her attention between eating and narrating everything she saw, a constant stream of observations about birds and clouds and the color of flowers. The foundation approved funding for another whistleblower case, Daniel mentioned between bites. Woman who discovered her hospital was billing Medicare for procedures they never performed. Good, Charles said. That's exactly the kind of case Lily would have wanted us to support. She's facing retaliation. Lost her job, getting threatened with lawsuits. We'll handle it. That's what the foundation exists for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Hope play. A year ago, such moments had felt fragile, like something that could shatter at any moment. But time and consistency had built something solid. They were family now, tested and proven. I've been thinking, Daniel said carefully, about telling Hope more details as she gets older. About what really happened to Lily. When do we have that conversation? Charles had wondered the same thing. Not yet. Right now she gets the version about Mama being brave and helping people. When she's older, maybe 8 or 9, we can start adding complexity. By the time she's a teenager, she should know everything. Even the hard parts? Victor, the murder, all of it. Especially the hard parts. She deserves the truth, not a sanitized fairy tale. But we present it in age-appropriate ways. We let her ask questions. We make sure she knows that evil exists, but so does courage. That people fail, but they can also choose to do better. Daniel nodded slowly. I want her to be proud of her mother. But I also want her to understand that being brave doesn't mean being fearless. Lily was terrified. She did the right thing anyway. That's the best kind of bravery, Charles agreed. Hope crawled over to them, demanding to be picked up. Daniel lifted her onto his shoulders, and she shrieked with delight, grabbing fistfuls of his hair. They walked together through the cemetery, Hope pointing at things and naming them in her expanding vocabulary. Bird, tree, flowers, peoples. Charles watched Daniel with his daughter and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. This man who owed them nothing had given everything. He had protected Hope when she was vulnerable. He had stood against powerful people seeking to destroy them. He had forgiven Charles for years of absence and embraced an unlikely partnership in parenting. Thank you, Charles said quietly as they walked. For what? For being exactly who you are. For loving Hope the way you do. For giving me a second chance to be part of a family. Daniel smiled. You don't have to keep thanking me. We're family. That's what family does. As the sun began to set, they returned to Lily's grave one final time. Hope was getting tired, her head resting against Daniel's shoulder. But she insisted on saying goodbye to Mama before leaving. Bye, Mama, Hope said, waving at the gravestone. Love you. We all love you, Charles added quietly. And we're keeping our promises. Hope is safe and loved. The foundation is helping people. Your story is inspiring change. Everything you fought for is continuing. Daniel planted a small tree seedling near the base of the oak, something they did periodically. So, she's never just a name, he said, echoing the promise from a year ago. Hope watched the planting with interest. What's that? That's a baby tree, Daniel explained. We're planting it so it can grow big and strong, just like you're going to grow big and strong. For Mama. For Mama. So there's always something living here with her. They walked to the car as evening shadows lengthened across the cemetery. Hope fell asleep in her car seat before they left the parking lot, exhausted from an afternoon of play. Charles and Daniel drove in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. At home, Daniel carried Hope inside and put her to bed while Charles made coffee. They sat in the living room afterward, a space that had evolved from Daniel's tiny apartment to a proper house they'd found together. Photos of Lily covered one wall. Hope's drawings and toys filled every corner. It was messy and warm and full of life. "Do you ever regret it?" Charles asked. "Taking on all this responsibility? You could have had a simpler life if you'd never gotten involved." Daniel considered the question seriously. "I could have had an easier life. I don't know if it would have been simpler or better. Hope brought meaning to everything. She gave me purpose when I was just going through motions. And honestly, Charles, you did too. This weird family we've built, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. Even with all the danger and media attention and stress. Even with all of that. Because at the end of the day, I get to be Hope's dad. I get to tell her stories about her brave mother. I get to watch her grow up safe and loved. That's worth any amount of difficulty." Charles felt tears prick his eyes. Lily chose well. She knew exactly who to trust with what mattered most. "We both did our best," Daniel said simply. "We're still doing our best. That's all we can do." Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Charles stood in the doorway of Hope's room watching her sleep. She lay curled around a stuffed rabbit, her breathing deep and even. She looked so much like Lily at this age. Same dark hair, same peaceful expression in sleep, same promise of becoming someone extraordinary. "Your daughter is beautiful," Charles whispered to Lily's memory. "She's brave and curious and kind, just like you were. I'm trying to give her the childhood you wanted for her. A world where truth matters, where courage is rewarded, where people protect each other instead of exploiting vulnerabilities. I know I failed you," he continued softly. "I know I can't go back and answer those phone calls or pay attention when you needed me. But I'm here now for Hope. I'm showing up every day. I'm choosing family over empire, love over power. I'm trying to be the person you needed me to be, even if I'm only getting the chance now." Hope stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep. Charles adjusted her blanket and kissed her forehead gently. "She's going to do amazing things," he said. "I can already see it. She has your spirit, your determination. And she has Daniel's kindness, his steady strength. She's going to grow up surrounded by love and truth. She's going to know her mother was a hero. And maybe if we do this right, she'll grow up to be brave, just like you." Charles turned off the light and closed the door halfway, leaving it open enough to hear if Hope called out. He stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the photos on the wall. Lily at various ages. Hope at various stages. Daniel and Charles with Hope between them. Patricia and Marcus at Hope's first birthday party. Their unconventional family captured in moments of joy. 3 years ago, Charles had visited a grave carrying nothing but grief and guilt. He had been a billionaire who had everything except what mattered. Now he had almost no money and more wealth than he'd ever imagined possible. He had a granddaughter who called him Papa. He had a friend who had become a brother. He had purpose beyond profit. He had family, real family, chosen family. And in the end, that was what survived after power died. Not empires or fortunes or corporate legacies, but love, connection, the decision to show up for people who needed you, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Charles returned to the living room and looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were facing impossible choices. Whistleblowers deciding whether to speak truth. Parents protecting children against powerful interests. Ordinary people trying to do extraordinary things because it was right. The Lily Whitmore Foundation would help as many as possible. Charles would testify at hearings and fund advocacy groups and use his remaining influence to push for change. Daniel would continue supporting patients who fell through healthcare cracks. Patricia would keep training nurses in ethical courage. Marcus would protect the vulnerable. And Hope would grow up knowing her mother died fighting for something that mattered. She would learn that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She would understand that one person standing up against corruption could change the world. That was Lily's real legacy. Not the foundation or the laws or the media coverage, but a daughter who would carry forward the belief that truth and justice and courage still mattered in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. Charles smiled, thinking of Hope's earnest face when she asked if she could be brave like Mama. The answer was yes. She already was, and she would continue to be, growing up in a world shaped by her mother's sacrifice and her family's love. The empire was gone. The money was gone. The power was gone. But what remained was so much better. Hope, love, purpose, family, everything that truly mattered. If you discovered that the people you trusted most had built an empire on lies and blood, would you have the courage to burn it all down, even if it meant losing everything you'd spent a lifetime building? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us that truth and love will always matter more than power and wealth.